I'm sharing 3 true winter horror stories that will make you think twice about stepping out into the snow. These aren't just tales, they're real accounts of people who faced the unimaginable during the coldest months of the year. From frozen forests to abandoned cabins, these stories will remind you that winter isn't just about cozy fires and hot cocoa. Sometimes, it's about survival and terror. Story 1, The Frozen Watcher. It was December 1998, and a group of 4 friends, Mark, Sarah, Jake, and Emily, decided to go winter camping in the remote forests of Colorado. They were experienced hikers, but this trip would be different. The forecast predicted heavy snowfall, but they were prepared, or so they thought. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that only comes with deep snow. The trees stood like frozen sentinels, their branches heavy with ice. The group set up camp near a frozen lake, unaware that they were being watched. On the first night, the temperature plummeted. The fire struggled to stay alive, and the wind sounded almost like whispers. Around midnight, Sarah woke up to the sound of crunching snow. She assumed it was an animal, but when she peeked out of her tent, she saw footprints circling their campsite, human footprints. The next morning, the group found strange markings in the snow. They looked like symbols, carved deliberately around the perimeter of their camp. Jake tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably a prank by another hiker, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, the temperature dropped even further. The group huddled together, trying to stay warm. Around 2 a.m., they heard it, a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the snow. Mark grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. What he saw would haunt him forever. Mark's flashlight beam landed on a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, with pale, almost translucent skin. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its breath came out in visible puffs, even though it wasn't wearing any winter clothing. The worst part? It was holding something, a deer carcass, frozen solid, clutched in its bony hands. The group screamed and scrambled to pack up their camp. As they fled, they heard the sound of footsteps following them, crunching through the snow. When they finally reached their car, they looked back and saw the figure standing at the tree line, watching them leave. The group reported the incident to the local rangers, but no trace of the figure was ever found. The only evidence was the strange symbols in the snow, which had mysteriously vanished by the time authorities arrived. To this day, Mark refuses to go winter camping, and Sarah swears she still hears the sound of crunching snow on cold, dark nights. The freezing temperatures, the isolation of the forest, and the heavy snowfall all contributed to the terror of that night. Winter has a way of amplifying fear, turning even the most familiar landscapes into something alien and dangerous. And sometimes, in the dead of winter, the cold isn't the only thing that wants to claim you. Story 2, The Snowbound Town. In the winter of 1974, a small mountain town in Vermont was hit by one of the worst blizzards in its history. The town, called Black Hollow, was completely cut off from the outside world. Roads were buried under feet of snow, and the power went out, leaving the residents in darkness. Among the townspeople was a young woman named Clara, who had recently moved to Black Hollow to escape a troubled past. She lived alone in a small cabin on the edge of town, where the forest loomed like a shadowy wall. The storm had trapped her inside, but she wasn't worried until the knocking started. On the third night of the storm, Clara was sitting by the fire, trying to stay warm, when she heard a faint knock at her door. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate. She hesitated, then grabbed a flashlight and peered through the window. The snow was falling so heavily that she couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. The knocking came again, louder this time. Clara called out, "Who's there?" But there was no answer. She considered opening the door, but something felt off. Instead, she locked it and backed away. That's when she heard the voice, a faint, raspy whisper coming from outside. "Let me in, it's so cold." Clara's heart raced as she grabbed a knife from the kitchen. She waited, listening, but the only sound was the howling wind. Just as she began to relax, the knocking started again, this time on the windows. She spun around, shining her flashlight, but saw nothing. Then, the power went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. Clara huddled in the corner of her living room, clutching the knife, as the knocking grew louder and more frantic. Then, she heard a new sound, a scratching, like nails dragging against the walls. She covered her ears, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She screamed, "Go away!" The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the door creaked open on its own, letting in a blast of freezing air. Clara's flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of light, she saw something standing in the doorway, a figure covered in snow, its face pale and gaunt, its eyes black as coal. It smiled at her, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and whispered. When the storm finally passed, the townspeople found Clara's cabin empty. The door was wide open, and the floor was covered in snow. There were no footprints leading away from the cabin, just a single set of tracks leading into the forest. Clara was never seen again. To this day, the people of Black Hollow tell stories about the Snowbound Stranger, a mysterious figure that appears during blizzards, looking for shelter. They say if you hear knocking during a snowstorm, don't answer, no matter how desperate the voice sounds. The blizzard created the perfect conditions for terror, isolation, darkness, and the relentless cold. In winter, the line between safety and danger becomes razor thin, and sometimes, the things that come knocking aren't looking for warmth, they're looking for something else entirely. Story 3, The Icebound Voyage. In 1921, a cargo ship named the Frostbane set sail from Norway to deliver supplies to a remote Arctic research station. The crew of 12 was experienced, but nothing could have prepared them for what they would face on that voyage. The journey began smoothly, but as they entered the Arctic Circle, the weather turned treacherous. The sea froze around them, trapping the ship in a vast, icy prison. The crew tried to stay optimistic, rationing supplies and keeping the ship's engines running to prevent the hull from being crushed by the ice. But as days turned into weeks, strange things began to happen. The crew reported hearing whispers in the wind and seeing shadows moving across the ice at night. The captain, a stoic man named Eric Larson, dismissed these as hallucinations caused by the extreme cold and isolation. But he was wrong. One night, the ship's first mate, Anders, woke to the sound of footsteps on the deck above. He grabbed his coat and went to investigate, thinking it might be one of the crew. When he reached the deck, he saw a figure standing near the bow, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. Anders called out, but the figure didn't respond. As he approached, the figure turned, and Anders froze in terror. Its face was gaunt and pale, its eyes hollow, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. Before Anders could react, the figure lunged at him, letting out an unearthly shriek. The crew rushed to the deck, but the figure was gone. All that remained was a trail of footprints leading to the edge of the ship, and then, inexplicably, continuing across the frozen sea. The crew was shaken, but the captain insisted it was a trick of the light. That changed the next morning, when they found Anders' cabin empty. His bed was covered in frost, and the window was wide open, though the temperature outside was well below freezing. Over the next few days, more crew members disappeared. Each time, their cabins were left frozen, with no signs of a struggle. The remaining crew grew paranoid, accusing each other of foul play. But the truth was far worse. One night, the ship's cook, Ingrid, saw something through the porthole, a group of figures standing on the ice, staring at the ship. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their bodies emaciated. Ingrid screamed, and the figures turned their heads in unison, their hollow eyes locking onto hers. The captain finally decided to abandon the ship, leading the remaining crew across the ice in a desperate attempt to reach land. As they trudged through the freezing darkness, they heard the sound of footsteps behind them. When they turned, they saw the figures from the ship following them, moving effortlessly across the ice. The crew ran, but the figures were faster. One by one, the crew members were overtaken, their screams echoing across the frozen wasteland. The captain was the last to fall. As he lay on the ice, bleeding and freezing, he saw the figures gather around him. They didn't speak, but their eyes seemed to glow with a cold, malevolent light. The last thing he saw was one of the figures leaning over him, its jagged teeth bared in a grin, before everything went dark. Months later, a rescue team found the Frostbane still trapped in the ice. The ship was completely abandoned, its cabins frozen and its decks covered in snow. The crew's belongings were still there, as if they had vanished into thin air. The only clue was a set of footprints leading away from the ship, but they didn't lead to land. They simply stopped in the middle of the frozen sea, as if the crew had been swallowed by the ice itself. To this day, no one knows what happened to the crew of the Frostbane. Some say they were taken by the spirits of the Arctic, vengeful beings that prey on those who dare to enter their frozen domain. Others believe the crew succumbed to madness, their minds shattered by the endless cold and darkness. But one thing is certain, the Arctic holds secrets that should never be uncovered. The extreme cold, the endless night, and the crushing isolation of the Arctic created the perfect conditions for terror. In winter, the natural world becomes a place of danger and mystery, where the line between life and death is as thin as the ice beneath your feet. And sometimes, in the heart of winter, the cold isn't just a force of nature, it's a living, breathing thing, waiting to claim its next victim. There's something about winter that makes it the perfect setting for horror. The cold, the darkness, and the isolation create an atmosphere where fear thrives. Winter forces us to confront the unknown, whether it's the shadows in the snow, the whispers in the wind, or the figures that appear in the frozen night. These stories remind us that winter isn't just a season of beauty, it's also a season of danger and mystery. If you liked this video and found it useful, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. See you next time.